Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the upcoming Israeli elections, the recent trilateral Jerusalem summit, and the Israeli airstrikes in Syria. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Dr. Nir Boms, a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Centre for Middle East Studies at Tel Aviv University, and Amir Tibon, Washington correspondent for Haaretz. Thank you so much both for joining me today. I do want to talk about the Israeli elections. Now we have a new change that happened, which is Ehud Barak announcing that he is going to go back to politics and probably also run for elections. How do you view the situation today? And I do want to start with Nir because Dr. Boms is actually with us from Tel Aviv, so I want to give you the opportunity to start on this.
Well, thank you, Hayvi, and it's very good to be here. I mean, obviously, this is very unusual time politically here. This is an unprecedented situation. We just had new election. We actually have 50 new members of Knesset. For many of them, it may be the first and last tenure they've ever had, and it's going to be a very short one because we have new elections scheduled now for September 17, and there are some efforts to even change that. So all of this is in many ways unprecedented, and part of what is expected, though.
There are some interest to change the date of the election set in September?
Well, one of the recent news items we've seen is that although following the elections, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, had passed a law to basically be dissolved and call for new elections. There's now an initiative by the chairman of the Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, along with that received the at least technical approval of the legal advisor of the Knesset, to examine the possibility of recalling the recalled election. And that they can do that with a supermajority of 80 members of Knesset, something that appears somewhat unlikely, but theoretically it's a possibility. And if you wish, it adds into the broader scenario of lack of political stability here, and in some ways, the somewhat, I would say, even crazy political reality that we see around us.
Mm-hmm. So it's very unprecedented, as Dr. Boms just said. Would you want to comment on that and the fact that also a figure like Ehud Barak, who's going to come back to politics, I mean, what's the equation that we're looking at today?
So I think what is happening right now in Israeli politics is basically that we are getting close to the end of the Netanyahu era. Maybe it will take years from now, but other politicians are sensing that Netanyahu, who is now 70 years old, soon to be, and 13 years in power, divided into 2 terms, but still 13 years, of them 10 in a row, there is a sense among the political leadership that his time in the leadership is coming to an end. It may be premature, it may be proven wrong, but it is causing many political figures who were on the sidelines for a long time to re-enter politics. One example was within Likud, Netanyahu's party, a politician named Gideon Saar, who used to be an education minister and had a spat with Netanyahu, had some kind of confrontation, and he took a break from politics for about, I think, 6 years, and suddenly came back into Likud. Mm-hmm. Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister in the late 1990s, and then was the defense minister under Netanyahu, working very closely with him. They had a joint agenda against Iran. He again took a break from politics, and suddenly he is re-emerging. And we're seeing more and more cases like this, and it has to do with the fact that people within the political scene believe there might be a big political change coming. Mm-hmm. Will they be proven right? I cannot predict the future. Netanyahu could just as well win the election and remain in power for a few more years. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we are seeing this instability that Nir talked about, mm-hmm. this constitutional crisis in a way about going to an election 3 months after we already had an election and then trying to cancel it, that is a constitutional crisis, and it all has to do with the same issue. The fact that right now the entire Israeli political system is focused on one question, Netanyahu, yes or no, and more people within the system believe that we are getting closer to the no answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to add, perhaps, Avi, something about the Netanyahu effect. Netanyahu's effect on Israeli politics was and still is dramatic. not just because of the longevity. Really, we've had a period in the Middle East of lack of stability. We had 10 years of Arab uprisings. We had years where the entire Middle East was up in arms. Governments were thrown, leaders found themselves in prison. The only thing, as one of my Jordanian colleagues told me not so long ago, that remains stable in this Middle East is Netanyahu. It's one perspective on this. Another perspective is when you're looking at the political reality in Israel. Who are the rivals of Netanyahu? Well, actually, most of them were his disciples. All those who are running against him were his own people, from the Secretary of Government to the Minister of Defense to the former Minister of Defense to Naftali Bennett. They were all people who were his people, who learned from him, who are in many ways are aligned with him politically, and therefore most of them are actually on the center right rather than the center left. But they had experienced Netanyahu, and then they said, well, perhaps it's time for leadership. Netanyahu did not like leadership, so every time when he had somebody who asserted leadership, he found a way to push them out of power, and therefore became a broader, larger circle of people that became foes for Netanyahu. Adds to that the legal issues, corruption issues, scandals, investigations that have been permeated and added up. Netanyahu found himself a little weaker than he was, with many more people who are out there to get him.
So I do want to go back to the originality of the problem. That was Lieberman's decision to not basically go ahead and go with the coalition that was already existed for the Netanyahu government. What, in your opinion, I mean, what is the scenario now for Lieberman? Some people are expecting that he's going to gain more votes because, and I don't know if that's something that you share, Amir, because of the fact that he stood up to whatever it is some people in Israel want, which is not to, not to go with the religious parties. Others say, no, he's actually going to lose because he's not going to gain the left votes and he's going to lose the right votes. I mean, what do you think is going to really happen? I want to hear both of your opinion. Let's start with you, Amir.
So I cannot predict, of course, what will happen. The election is 2 months from now, and 2 months in Israeli politics is not even eternity, it's infinity. But I do think for Lieberman, he is a veteran, calculated politician. In every recent election in Israel, the media predicted that Lieberman will go down, maybe will not even make it into the parliament, into the Knesset, and he somehow succeeded. Lieberman has a strong hold on his base of supporters. It's a diminishing population, but it's basically Israelis who immigrated from the former Soviet Union, from Russia and Ukraine and other countries. He speaks for them, he represents them, and he has a strong hold on them. What he's trying to do right now, this is his calculation, it's a bit of a bet, a bit of a gamble. He's trying to appeal to a wider part of the electorate by saying, I am right-wing, but also secular. And I will stand up for secular Israelis who feel that the country is becoming too religious, that the religious parties and the religious authorities have too much power. And he believes this will help him grow. This is his calculation. Will it work or not? Again, I cannot say. So far in public opinion polling, we have seen a boost for Lieberman. We have seen his party grow a little bit. But 2 months from now, it's impossible to say. For Lieberman, the challenge is to keep this issue, the issue of religious tensions in Israel, within the Jewish population, between religious and secular, to keep it on the agenda. If this is what people talk about and think about when they go to vote in 2 months, he has a good chance to grow.
What do you think, Dr. Boms? Because this is a very important aspect, I think, of what's going on right now.
Well, yes, and I agree with Amir. First, it's difficult to predict, and second, I think it's kudos for Lieberman for what he was able to do, assuming that this is what he wanted to do. And then time will tell whether his gamble was the right one. In many ways, he was the one who was able to take the government down. And on what issue? Yes, this is church and state, religious related politics. But really, he raised a flag that if you go a little deeper into it, some would argue, well, is this a real principled flag? the principle of whether the state is becoming a bit more influenced by Orthodox or religious circles is a valid issue. This has been a valid political issue. There have been other parties that had raised that flag. This particular legislation and arrangement that has to do with the recruitment of ultra-Orthodox to the military, something that was very much supported by the establishment, the security establishment, and then Lieberman came against it. Perhaps it was not the best flag one can think of, but Lieberman was able to make it a flag. It certainly served to strengthen his resolve as a politician that is able to really be principled. But perhaps other people will say, well, look, you're principled, but this is not the right principle. There are other people who can vouch for a secular position within Israel. This is not really a crisis that one can describe and where the country completely drifts into religiously influenced politics. And therefore, it could be that although he succeeded in doing what he wanted to do, is take the government down, he will find himself outside of parliament, because the threshold is a serious threshold. He needs to have a significant number of people, 4 seats at least, with 325, and this is something that he hardly scratched in the past election, and he needs a real boost to actually increase his power as he would like to, and it could be that eventually you will see a little bit of an increase, but if you were asked me for a prediction, I do not think that Lieberman will emerge again as he did in his peak days to be the 3rd largest party in Israel.
Mm-hmm. But if we do, both of you agree that Lieberman might be getting enough votes to maintain at least his position that he had before, what would that mean for the upcoming elections? Because many people predict that the Likud will still be the winner of the next coming election. But what does it mean for the Lieberman's position and that, implications on Netanyahu?
So I think the big question that none of us have the answer to, and some people pretend they do, but nobody really does, is what will be the makeup of the electorate? Who will be the people that go to vote on election day? This makes a huge difference in Israeli politics. In the previous election, the Arab sector in Israel, 20% of the population, voted in very low numbers. Almost half of the Arab population did not go to vote. And that gave an advantage to the entire right-wing religious bloc of parties. Of course, then they had an internal dispute between Lieberman and the religious parties. But if Lieberman and the religious parties did not have this fight, the right wing would be in power. The big question, I think, is, first of all, will there be an increase in the Arab vote in this election? Last time around, the Arab parties in Israel fought between themselves, had all kinds of ego competitions. The Arab public was disgusted and punished them at the ballot box. Now there is again a discussion of the different Arab parties joining forces together, running on one platform. Mm-hmm. And if they do it, I suspect the Arab voting percentage will go up, and that could change the makeup of the Knesset. A second urgent question for Netanyahu: what happens with all the various religious right-wing parties? Will they run in a united front, or will they run in smaller parties, and then 1 or 2 of them could not make it into the parliament? And so these 2 questions will make a huge difference in terms of who has a majority and who has a good chance to form a government. And of course, Lieberman blowing up the right-wing bloc and putting a real religious rift within it doesn't make it any easier for Netanyahu. But I would say even before the question about Lieberman, the big one is what happens with the Arab voters and how do the religious votes get split between the parties.
What's your comment on that, Dr. Boms?
Well, I'll add 2 other factors. First is the percentage of participation, similar to what Amir just mentioned. There is a prediction, and that people get a little tired of, yet again, another election. The majority of people, when they were polled, they were not very happy with this move. Election fatigue. That means that it may be that less people will come to vote, but the people who will come to vote are those connected to more ideological parties. If that's the case, it will actually give an advantage to the ultra-Orthodox parties who have loyal voters, to the Arab parties, if they will be able to reinvigorate the joint Arab list, to the more right-wing parties, again, who will have more ideological voters, and will actually potentially weaken some of the parties in the center. we need to also understand that if you zoom out from these elections and looking at the broader political picture in Israel, you can argue that although there's been very significant changes, we have the blue-white party that, similarly to the party of Kadima, that the one that Ariel Sharon created, that all of a sudden became the largest party in Israel's history, and then election cycle later became the smallest one. You have a scenario in where still the vote in Israel is staying right around the center right. It has not moved so much. People have changed, figures have changed, but agendas have not changed significantly. And that is part of the prediction that you actually, in this particular election, we received, although we did not really receive the government, but the assumption was that we're getting something not that different than what was, particularly if it is under Netanyahu. If it's not under Netanyahu, then everything can change. Coalitions can change. A potential scenario of a unity, especially if Netanyahu has a potential exit strategy, which will actually enable this scenario to happen. Some have commented that even now, if Netanyahu is moving out of the picture, which is again very unlikely, then the scenario of having a unity party and canceling the elections is much more feasible. All of these things can happen. All of a sudden, the new party of Ehud Barak can get a certain boost. Other people may join. We may see that Labour Party decides to join one of the new parties. And all of that can create some interesting new realities that eventually can cause a very significant change and potentially an end of the Netanyahu era, which is certainly going to be significant because it will influence really all facets of government and politics here.
Hayvi, I just want to say, to our viewers, if you're feeling confused right now by all the different parties that Nir and I are mentioning, all the different scenarios, you are not alone. Many Israelis feel the same. Many Israelis are looking at this election, like Nir said, with a bit of dread, a bit of fatigue. It's great that we have a functioning democracy and that we get to vote, and not only once in the same election, but actually twice in a way. We already had an election, there's a redo. But at the same time, there is a sense I'm getting in conversations with friends, with family, that people are tired and confused. They feel there are too many parties, too many possibilities. It's like going to the supermarket and facing one of those shelves where you have 20, 30 different kinds of products. Some of them look great, some of them look okay. And it's just, people are feeling that there's too much of a complicated system right now. And I think this goes back to what we talked about, feeling that we are stuck in some kind of a transformation era between the Netanyahu days and the post-Netanyahu days. And nobody is sure yet how close we are to the days after Netanyahu, or are we still in the midst of his rule? And this is causing a crazed election system in Israel, crazed political system.
That might also be canceled or postponed again.
You see, that makes it even more difficult to follow.
So it's a very unpredictable situation. My question is, because there is that talk about, okay, is Prime Minister Netanyahu going to stay or is he not? Who are the alternatives to Benjamin Netanyahu in the Likud that could actually replace him and have a people, rallying around them?
Within Likud, there is a new generation, younger generation of leaders. They are all younger than Netanyahu, at least by a decade or two. It includes Gideon Saar, who I mentioned before, used to be the education minister, Gilad Erdan, who is the minister in charge of the police, Israel Katz, who is the minister of foreign affairs and used to be minister of transportation, and a few other names are also potential runner-ups in this list. But all of them are afraid right now to challenge Netanyahu directly. What is happening with these politicians is fascinating. Secretly, quietly, behind closed doors, they are rooting hard for Netanyahu's failure. Nothing would make them happier than for Netanyahu to lose the election, even if it means Likud would lose power for 2 or 3 years and Benny Gantz would become prime minister. They believe that from the opposition or as senior ministers sitting with Gantz in the same government, they could pave their way into leading their movement and then conquering the country. But because Netanyahu is immensely popular with the voters of Likud and with the members of the party who choose the leadership, none of these politicians will confront him out in the open. So they will brief the journalist behind closed doors with all kinds of information against Netanyahu, but then go on television like Nir and I, right now, and praise him and say that he's the greatest thing that ever happened to the country. And they are in some kind of a limbo because just like us, they don't know how much time does Netanyahu still have in the barrel. Is it 2, 3, 4 years or 2, 3, 4 months? And that is causing confusion and agony for these Likud politicians as well.
Yes, so there's not one person that could challenge Benjamin Netanyahu at this point. I mean, do you agree, Nir? Because I saw your face, I was wondering, are you agreeing or disagreeing with what Amir just said?
This is the beauty of our democracy, or that hyper democracy. I very much agree with what Amir said. Perhaps the person who came a little closer of challenging or releasing some statements, or at least later accused of doing so, is Gideon Sa'ar, who took time off from political life and then got back, and is perceived as somebody who is a bit more independent, perhaps, than the rest. But there is some loyalty to Likud and to its leader, and there's also, I think, a certain fear that if there's going to be an infighting inside Likud, it's going to weaken Likud's power, something that obviously the leadership do not particularly seek. But all of these scenarios, including those that we've described, what will happen if all of a sudden somehow Netanyahu will move aside a little bit and pave the way for an emergency unity government? It could be that some of these suggestions and scenarios that you hear or hear say sometimes are there to test these ideas, because there are some voices in Likud that would like to see a different era. They believe that, again, the Netanyahu has been a prime minister with much credit is deserved for a good number of actions for the sake of Israel's security, certainly for in terms of his supporters. He delivered. He is a statesman. He is a leader. He is able to keep relations with the United States and Putin at the same time. He was able to keep Israel out of the Arab Spring turmoil dynamic. Israel's economy is doing fine. Netanyahu is respected. But all of that, again, seems to be coming to its end. And all of these investigations and scandals surrounding Netanyahu and his team, and now his wife and his family and his son, eventually gives an indication that perhaps it's about time to end this. Perhaps it's time for Netanyahu to go, even for the sake of Likud. Because if Netanyahu was the main asset of Likud, and if now Netanyahu becomes a burden, and if that's part of the discourse, then there's going to be more voices from the inside the party that will say, look, this is the time to move, because really this is the party, not just the individual. And everything needs to have an end, even if it's not always a happy end.
I mean, Dr. Boms, I do want to ask you, because you mentioned the scandals around Prime Minister Netanyahu and his family. How much are those scandals going to affect this upcoming elections?
Well, like anything, it's about mobilizing the core versus polarizing the rest. One of the things that we've seen here recently, and I would say that it is becoming a bit similar to what I observe from a distance in the United States, is the process of polarization of politics. You hear much more the terms left and right. It was very interesting in this crisis, in the latest development with Netanyahu and Lieberman. Netanyahu says everything that is not Likud is really left, including Lieberman. Lieberman is asking Netanyahu, well, the person who is perceived as a sign of the right wing, disciple of Netanyahu, lives in the settlement. So the person who lives in Caesarea, Lieberman asks, who is a bastion really of the left, the more wealthy, affluent, socialist, left-wing part of the country, is calling the person who lives in the settlement a lefty. All of that is something which is very interesting, because this polarization is something that gets this type of dynamic, in where people either think they're going one way or another. And in order to heal the country, in order to bring this country to a different place, other people are saying we need to have a different discourse, because we need to stop with this polarizing discourse. And Netanyahu is now considered as the person who is the archetype of this polarized discourse. It's either me or something which is very much the opposite and very, very bad. And everyone who disagrees with me falls into the other camp. But the other camp, in many ways, is growing. And therefore, Netanyahu, I think, finds himself, begins to be as a bit of a burden in that sense. He's putting all the coins in one part of the game, with some hope that, again, mobilizing the core will help. But at some point, there is even some of the core begins to ask whether this really is an asset or begins to be a burden.
So, I mean, both of you agree that it's a debate here. We're talking about people, and at the same time, it's the right and center. We're not even talking about the left at this point. And, you know, we're not going to go deep into this discussion because we can talk about, you know, the peace options, how realistic and how what would accept and who would accept. And, you know, this is an entire new episode, I think, that we're not going to get into.
2 episodes, maybe.
Today, yeah, probably 3. So what we will do is, you know, let's focus on the foreign policy aspect, because the fears of like the left, like the idea is the left in Israel like the left in the United States in the big Iran question? And I know that you've answered this, Amir, before on this show, but I do want to kind of talk about this a little bit more. Israel has been consistent striking IRGC forces in Syria. Just a couple of days ago, another airstrikes. You know, this is perceived very positively in the region. So I just want to hear about your perspective on what would that mean in this upcoming election, if we're talking about a center or a different person within the Likud, or the obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu staying in power. You know, how do you see this upcoming probably tensions that we're seeing rising in the region towards Iran?
I think Iran is one of the only issues in Israeli politics where the question of who would be the next prime minister, who will form the next government, will not change almost at all. You know, it won't make a big difference. Let's look at the personalities. We said this election is more about personalities. There is Netanyahu. We know his agenda on Iran. Then there is Benny Gantz, who is challenging him from the center. Benny Gantz used to be the chief of staff of the Israeli military under Netanyahu, carrying out a lot of these bombing missions that we are talking about.
Against the IRGC and Hezbollah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is a guy who's, most of his formative years in the military were fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I don't think if he becomes prime minister, the agenda is going to change. Then we have the new player that you mentioned, who is trying to lead the left, Barak. Barak also used to be the chief of staff of the military, and he was defense minister under Netanyahu, and they were working together like this against the Iranians. They were, at the time, the fear in Israel was that Barak and Netanyahu will try to start a war with Iran without the approval of the rest of the government. This is 7 years ago, 8 years ago, when they were very close together. I don't think Barak has become less confrontational towards Iran. So you do see that on this issue, it doesn't really matter left wing, center, right wing. There is a consensus that Israel needs to be tough against Iran, that it needs to push back against the Iranian aggression and against Iran's involvement in the region. There might be some tactical differences. For example, how to address the question of America's withdrawal from the Iran deal, how to address the European reaction to it, but not when it comes to Iranian presence on Israel's borders. On that, there is a very wide consensus, and it won't make a big difference who will lead the country on this specific question.
What do you like to add to that, Amir? I mean, the nuclear issue is a persistent issue. We now know that Iran is enriching uranium. I mean, this is a real issue that we have to kind of probably going to see the confrontation there sooner or later. What are the options for Israel, in your opinion?
Look, there are a number of options, and that now just yesterday, the head of Mossad, Yossi Cohen, came to an important conference here and actually gave a public speech where he took credit for some Mossad operations against Iran and said that there are a number of tools in the arsenal that Israel will stand steadfastly against the Iranian involvement in the region and will prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon. Of course, some of it was to reiterate the policy that is very well known. Of course, there were some other examples when we have seen that, throughout the years. All of a sudden, there were mysterious viruses in the centrifuges. There were some operations that influence the conduct of the Iranian nuclear program. There were some mysterious deaths of people involved in that program. There was the operation that brought out of Iran the famous nuclear archives, and perhaps there are more that can be pursued on something that has to do with the scenario of an actual war, an attempt of bombing some nuclear sites. This is something that was discussed a number of times in a number of iterations in a number of years. And so far, the people in the lead had taken the assessments of the risk assessments and the intelligence assessments of the security establishment and decided not to pursue it. It certainly appears as a last end result or a last end potential move because of the risks involved. There's an understanding that sometimes you need to have very tough rhetoric and sometimes even more than that in order to actually prevent the war rather than to start the war. This is part of the analysis of the Iranian, let's say, bombing of all tankers in the Gulf in order to actually move to the negotiations with a certain position of power. And there's probably some hope that we won't need to get to it. I mean, overall, certainly under Netanyahu, who is known to be somewhat risk-averse, he would rather to have another postponement of a confrontation with Hamas and move more Qatari money there, which is a strange reality considering, the position of Qatar vis-a-vis Israel overall, just to really avoid another escalation and confrontation that will influence the Israeli public and will cause casualties. So yes, all options are open, but things have not changed significantly. And there may be another, again, looming attempt to re-engage in another deal. Perhaps the deal of the century is not going to be between Israelis and Palestinians. Perhaps it will just be about re-engaging with a certain version of another Iran deal.
Do you want to comment on that?
I just want to add, I agree with what Nir said 100%. I want to add that politically, the only scenario I can imagine where Iran plays a big political role is maybe forcing a unity government. If there is a sense of a coming confrontation, security crisis with Iran and Hezbollah, this will cause severe damage to Israel. The scenarios that are discussed within the Israeli military are very dire, very bleak. And I think in a situation where there is a real risk of rockets falling on Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem, there will be a push for a unity government in Israel so that these heavy prices will be paid out of a place of as much consensus and national unity as it's possible to create. And I'm not saying this is where we are going, but if a confrontation with Iran becomes a real possibility, that's where the political system will probably move. We will probably see Netanyahu and Gantz saying we have our disagreements, but we can put them aside over this important issue. But again, right now, we don't know if that's where we are heading, because perhaps, like Nir said, there will be an attempt by the Trump administration and by Europe to go for another deal to avert this catastrophic war scenario. We know that for President Trump here in Washington, he's concerned about his own re-election chances next year, and he's been influenced by some people around him, people on Fox News and Senator Rand Paul and others who are more isolationist, and they've been telling him the last thing you need for re-election is another war in the Middle East. So we'll see how that plays out as well.
I mean, this is an important question, because how does the Israeli public view this? And Nir, I mean, you go to the Syrian borders, you see what's going on. Israel is helped the Syrian refugees at some point. Now it consistently has the airstrikes against the Iranian militias in Syria. In your opinion, how does the Israeli public view this? And would that help Prime Minister Netanyahu and his elections, this ongoing situation, or is it, something that probably is scary and is not popular amongst the people?
Well, the Israeli public, unfortunately, is used to live under threat. The Iranian threat is different because it's more existential. With all the respect to rockets from Hamas or even from Hezbollah, this is something that is not existential to the very existence of the state of Israel, and particularly the nuclear threat is something that Israel cannot tolerate. This is something that the public understands. I think, as Amir said, there is a consensus around this issue, and therefore there is less of an argument there. the Israelis are also have certain reliance on the security establishment. They believe that there are people who work very hard on these issues and will do broadly what they can, and there are some safeguards to the system to make sure that there's not going to be something completely done haphazardly, like starting a war if it's not absolutely needed. And it's not that there were not cases where prime ministers have used wars for their political purposes or operations, military operations, or have lost their prime ministership because of a war. Let's take the case of Prime Minister Ulmer for that matter. But the Israeli public understands that if there is a real imminent war threat from Iran, I agree with Amir that we need to coalesce and move together in order to deal with it. And if there's going to be a scenario in where there needs to be a response and there is no other way to prevent it but having an Israeli response, even without an American backing, again, scenario that looks slightly less plausible. At this point, I think the Israeli public, for the most part, will go with it. Again, if there's going to be a real assessment that there is something imminent that cannot be sorted out in any other way.
Amir, we now also know that there's an Israeli, trading office that's going to open in one of the Arab countries, and there's all these diplomatic visits. What are the impacts of this? How do you view this as an Israeli, as a journalist working on these issues? How significant are these historical events to Israel and to the region?
Any instance where we see Israel getting closer to some of our neighbors, I think personally is a good thing, and we should welcome it and be happy about it. And we are seeing more and more examples about Israel finding common interests with Arab countries in the region, whether it's the Gulf countries, some countries in northern Africa. Of course, some of it has to do with the fact that we have common enemies, Iran, Hezbollah, and from the Sunni side of the divide, ISIS. And some of it has to do with natural interests, economic and cultural, that can be advanced. And of course, we still have one major roadblock, which is the Palestinian issue, and we know it, and we hear it all the time from the Arab foreign ministers. We just saw the foreign minister of Bahrain give interviews to Israeli TV channels and repeat the message. He said, we want to get closer to Israel, we have common interest with Israel, we want to work together, but we also need you to be flexible. And this is something that it's been, but I think the general movement is a positive movement. The general trajectory is a good one. And we need to keep encouraging it and keep moving in the right direction, because I really think that Israel can contribute a lot to the Middle East, and Israel can benefit a lot from better ties in the Middle East. We can learn from each other, work with each other. There is a big potential future there.
But you saw, Nir, what happened also after the Bahraini foreign minister appeared on the Israeli channel. We saw an attack on the Bahraini embassy in Iraq. In your opinion, we see that there's people in the region who are still very anti-Israel. They are more on the Islamic side, on the Muslim Brotherhood side. There's people who have these issues, and they say, they blame these leaders for opening up channels with Israel, and they can't find, why would they do that? In your opinion, is this movement by these governments going to make, is it going to change the region as we know it? Are we witnessing the beginning of something?
I believe we are. The fact that there is resistance to Israel, the fact that there is opposition to Israel and hate and even venom toward Israel is nothing new. The fact that we now have other voices in the region that begin to look at this differently is new. And this, by the way, is also not so new. We have been seeing this for at least 15 years. We're now seeing more and more of it. Just in the last year and a half, we've seen the Israeli national anthem being sang in Dubai in the sports competition. We've seen Israeli delegations in the Gulf. We have seen the visit in Oman. We've now seen Bahrain. We've seen a number of public appearances. We've seen op-eds written in Arab newspapers by Israeli officials. All of these, and I've witnessed actually some of this myself, I've seen unprecedented relationship with civic society, with academics, with institutions, particularly in the Gulf, increased business network that is being developed. And again, slowly, some of these things are coming to the open. But the other interesting thing is this pragmatic approach associated with some of this. We used to the notion of the Middle East, we need to look at it through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This has been the factor of all things. This has been the reason of all things, and the key for moving the Middle East in a different direction. The Arab Spring had helped shatter that. The Middle East conflict, with all the respect to it, was not responsible for the revolution in Syria, was not responsible for Sidi Bouaziz and for what had started in Tunisia, was not responsible for what had happened in Egypt, was not responsible for what had happened in Libya. So the Arab world has moved a bit from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and there were other issues, and there is also another rift, another borderline, because on the one hand, now you have pragmatic Arab leaders that are saying, we actually understand and recognize that not only Iran is a problem, but also some radical streams starting from the Muslim Brothers, certainly going to more radical streams like the Islamic States or Al-Qaeda and other Islamists related, are a problem because this is a source of lack of stability. Israel sees the region in a very same way. And therefore, there is a bit of a hope, because now they're saying, look, we need to sort the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not just because it's good for the Palestinians and they're our brothers, it's also because it helps radicals. So now we need to push a bit more to do that, but having a bit of a more pragmatic approach to it. So this hope comes with responsibility. If Israel and the Palestinians would not know how to use it, perhaps it can go back and revert into what we've seen. But I think that the aggregation of these interests in these opportunities, the economic opportunities, and the fact that I think many in the region understands that if you want to survive here, we need to move back into the center, including when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, actually serves as a signal of hope that these alliances are not going to be short-lived, and that they can signal the beginning of what may be a new era of mutual acceptance in the region, in where the region will be able to deal with so many problems it has in development, economy, radicalization, and it needs to do that once it begins to clear some of the radical elements, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Beautiful. I just want to, end with you, Amir, real quick. This is a historical time politically in Israel with very historical circumstances that, it's the Benjamin Netanyahu government who was able to open these doors and create these new relations. Isn't that very sensitive to have this crisis while this is happening at the same time?
This is always the challenge of Israel, being a democratic country in a region that is not democratic, unfortunately. And this has always been a dilemma for Israelis. We've had all kinds of unbelievable scenarios taking place regionally, security-wise, and at the same time deal with our own political troubles. The previous Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, he ordered a strike on a Syrian nuclear reactor at the same time that he was dealing with political troubles and corruption investigations. And actually, I think less than a year after Olmert gave the order to take down the Syrian nuclear reactor, I think the most important decision of an Israeli prime minister probably in the last 15 years. After he did that, a year later, he was out of power because of his corruption investigations. And we look at Ariel Sharon, who was prime minister before, he pulled Israel out of Gaza, historic decision, very consequential for the future of the country, and at the same time was battling his own troubles. And Netanyahu is going through the same situation right now. And this is the price of being a democracy. I think that most Israelis are willing to pay it. They understand that with the security challenges and with the need to have stability, we also want to keep our strong democracy, being a liberal, proud country where people can vote and influence and there's public discourse. And yes, this is the challenge of Israel.
Dr. Boms, would you like to add something about this very important point on how this might change the outcome that we've been seeing?
Well, as Amir said before, the 2 months here in the Middle East is almost eternity. Things can change in 5 minutes, and often they do. So unfortunately, I will have to concur that it's too early to predict how all of this will change the immediate scenario and dynamic here. But there is a sense that the region is going to a change, and our particular political system, and including the Palestinian one, will go through a change. That the Netanyahu era, the peak of it, is behind us. That's the end, or that a new leadership will emerge sooner rather than later because of either the political corruptions or the election results. The same may apply for the Palestinian side, again, partially because of the age and the weakness of Abu Mazen. And all of that, I think, encourages new voices, new ideas that potentially can bring about new hope, because, again, people on both sides that I think see a certain need for a change, realizing that we got ourselves too stuck in a certain dynamic, that we need something a bit different to break it. The last elections, one of the things it showed is that people believe in change and believe in new voices. We have no less than 49 actually members of Knesset. For them, it's the first Knesset. Again, almost half, 40%, who are elected as first-timers. And that means that particularly the Israelis are sometimes willing and perhaps even have a tendency to vote for something new and to vote for change or give change a chance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nir Boms, joining us from Tel Aviv. I really enjoyed this discussion. And thank you so much, Amir, for coming on with us again here from Washington, D.C. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.